Hello, everyone. This video is on Shakespeare's World and Influence and is our first video lecture for our Shakespeare course online. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you all. And I'm going to go ahead and start the slideshow here. Okay, you should be able to see that now. So many of you probably have heard about Shakespeare before taking this class, right? He's known as the greatest playwright of all time and probably the greatest writer in the English language. There's a couple of reasons for this, and we're going to dive into them in this slideshow, okay? He was born in 1564, and he died in 1616. He was born about 100 years after the printing press was invented, so that had a huge impact on society. In fact, even with today's technological advances, the invention of the printing press, the ability to spread a printed document quickly and make copies of it quickly, is considered to be the most life-changing invention of all time for humanity. You can just imagine how hard it would have been to copy something and spread the word of it up until that point. So that had a huge impact on Shakespeare. Stratford-upon-Avon is where he grew up. He attended the New King's School in Stratford until middle school. He would have studied there rhetoric, logic, history, and Latin. So you may have heard before some criticism saying like, oh, Shakespeare couldn't have written all those works himself. He wasn't necessarily, part of the aristocracy, and he wouldn't have learned these things. He did study up through middle school these kinds of topics. And so to the best of our knowledge, we do think that Shakespeare was one man and that he did do a lot of this work. He built upon others' work in some cases, like Othello, which we're going to read, was actually originally a story called The Moorish Captain that he changed and adapted into a play. But, he wrote the play and he wrote all the language in the play and he changed the story a little bit and he inserted these really strong themes into it, of racial tension, some of the things that were going on at the time. So that's all credited to him. Shakespeare's early life, he married Anne Hathaway, who was pregnant at the time with their first daughter. She was older than he was. She was 26 and he was 18, which was a little bit scandalous at that time. And he did get made fun of and sort of jabbed about that. Some of that is in some of his sonnets, where you'll see this sort of making fun of folks who are marrying older women. So it is what it is. They had twins in 1585, Hamnet and Judith. And if you've heard of the play Hamlet, at the time, Hamnet and Hamlet were interchangeable, almost like nicknames. Like my first name's Abigail, but to those close to me, I go by Abby. It was kind of like that. And Hamnet died from the plague at age 11. That play was written afterwards as a way of processing and mourning his son, it's thought, okay? Sometime between 1583 and 1592, he moved to London and began working in theater. But we don't know the exact time. The years in there are called sort of the lost years. We don't know exactly what he was doing, but we do know that he had moved to London and that he began working in theater. There's 38 plays that he wrote that are firmly attributed to William Shakespeare. That is an incredible amount of writing to do, an incredible amount of work, especially with the talent at which he did it. There's 14 comedies, 10 histories, 10 tragedies, 4 romances, and he possibly wrote 3 others. In this class, we're going to end up reading 2 tragedies and 1 comedy. And that'll take us through because we don't have time for more, really. He also collaborated on several others where, it was a group of folks or he was lending a hand to a friend. He wrote a lot of poetry. He had 2 major poems and then 154 sonnets. Numerous other styles of poems as well. In fact, his sonnets, he actually developed a new type of sonnet called the Shakespearean sonnet. We don't have time to get into that in this class, but if you are interested in it, I'd love to chat about it. It's really interesting. He sort of invented a new style that's very difficult to write in. Iambic pentameter, 14 lines with a rhyming couplet at the end. And that's it's his signature style. He worked, wrote, performed in the Globe Theatre. You may have heard of this. He worked with a group called Lord Chamberlain's Men that he sort of oversaw and was part of. In 1599, Shakespeare, with his friends and with his group, built the Globe Theatre together. He was the primary investor. He invested 12.5%. He was not a rich man, but he poured a lot into this. It was 30 feet high with its stage 44 to 43 feet across. It's where his plays were performed. And the audience was very active and live in the performance. So they would actively boo, cheer, hiss, throw vegetables, maybe things you've seen in movies as depicting of that time. And it's actually accurate, where they were very much part of it. It was live, you know. Women were not allowed on stage. So all of the women in the plays that we're about to read were played by men. And if you've read some of Shakespeare's plays before, you'll know that he tends to like to play with cross-dressing at times, where he'll have a man dressed as a woman or a woman dressed as a man. You'll see this in the introduction to Taming of the Shrew. And you can imagine that it was a man already playing a woman. And then if they're dressing like a man or dressing, you know, like somebody else, there's a lot of layering of costumes. And that was meant to be funny. It was meant to be a joke, even though it was because women weren't as valued as men in the society. That's why they weren't allowed on the stage. Okay. The original Globe Theatre was burned down in 1613, just 3 years before Shakespeare's death, during a performance of Henry VIII, after a real cannon went off and set fire to the thatched roof. But a close replica was rebuilt in 1997. So if you are ever in the area, I haven't ever seen it, but it would be amazing to see. This is what it looks like. And this is, again, a very close replica to what it would have looked like during Shakespeare's time. Shakespeare's language is really an important thing to touch on here. One, because students and others often complain that it's really hard to read. But two, because he had such a tremendous impact on the English language. And it's important to see why, you know, why did he have this impact, and why do people question then, like, how could one man have had this enormous impact? Well, part of that is because of the time in which he was born, and the time in which he was doing his writing was such an advantageous time for a genius such as himself with the English language. He did not write in Old English, even though it sounds like Old English, and that's what we want to call it. I want to show you Old English is the language of Beowulf, and it's really hard to read. This is what it looks like. It doesn't even contain all Latin letters. It has some of the old rune symbols in it. English is originally a Germanic language, and we did not use the Latin alphabet like A, B, C, D. We used runes, these like sort of markings that were later associated with witchcraft, and people who took over England said we had to, you know, use the Latin alphabet. So eventually we transitioned to the ABCs, but this is sort of a conglomeration of those two, and I can't read it at all in the original Old English, but you can see the translation down here. It says, "Hey, we have heard of the glory of the Spear Danes in the old days, the kings of tribes, how noble princes showed great courage." Okay, so you can see the drastic difference there. So there's also a song here called "Summer Is A-Comin' In." That's kind of a cool way of hearing what Old English would have sounded like. Let me go ahead and share this with you. You can just listen. Okay, so I know that is maybe a little bit different to hear. That is Old English, and the title of it is "Summer Is A-Comin' In," which if you hear it, you can hear something familiar there. It sounds like summer is coming in, which that's essentially what it means. Summer is coming. This is previous to the tremendous influence that French had on English, where a lot of the words came from French. In fact, 1/3 of the English language became French, and it has much more of its Germanic roots as a language. And so while some of it is understandable, a lot of it is not. Okay, so I give you this background so that you can take heart and know that Shakespeare's language is in modern English. It is much more familiar to us than that. Between the 8th and 10th centuries, written English started to flourish, and a lot of great works were published in Europe at that time. Beowulf, The Dream of the Rood, The Wanderer, The Seafarer, The Battle of Maldon. If you've heard of any of these are great works that were written in Old English, okay? The amazing thing about Old English was it was very flexible. So it was innovative, and you had the capacity to create words that you wanted. Today, there's not the same attitude about this. Ever since really the printing press was invented and we started to like nail down these word canons, like these are the words that belong in English and these don't, if you invent a new one. It was not that way back in the day. Language was always changing, but English, because it was a Creole language, it was a mix of languages actually, and it was a poor people's language for a long time. You could invent words. So people would come up with things like gliobeam meant heart, or gleewood, or bonhouse for body, meaning bone house. Like, I don't know, what do you call this, right? It's a bone house. Body that makes sense, right? So you could come up with those kinds of things. And the plasticity of the language is what kept Old English from becoming standardized as quickly as other languages. The push for standardization came from the printing press, where they said like, okay, no, we have to have like a certain word for this. You can't just invent words. Everybody has to be able to read it and know what you're talking about if we're going to print out copies of things. So there was this push to standardize more and more and more. But English still wasn't quite standardized by the time Shakespeare came around. Shakespeare also did not write in Middle English. This would be the next version of English that we find. It's a little easier to read. This was the language of Chaucer. Hundreds of spellings were acceptable at this time when the printing press was just, developing and people were writing things out. This is a list of the ways in which people spelled church. So you can see kirk, church, all these different spellings were based on people sounding it out according to their dialect. So like, how there's regional dialects. Well, people traveled even less during that time. So there was even more regional dialects. So I said something slightly different than you said something. So we spelled it differently because we're all spelling it as best we can, right? So hence the push for like standardization as well. So kind of interesting to see though. By the time Shakespeare came around, he wrote in early modern English. Early modern English is not all that different from our modern English, except it does have some old holdovers. The flexibility of language was still there. So Shakespeare, we said he was one of the greatest writers of the English language. Partially that's because he was constantly inventing new words and phrases, and English was still flexible enough, was not yet hardcore standardized, so that he could do this. So that is why he was able to do this, which is kind of incredible. Just to give you a little bit of a perspective here, these are the ways in which Shakespeare's name was spelled during his time, during his life, like the time that he was alive, which is also why there was like, okay, is this the same Shakespeare or a different Shakespeare? And part of that, again, is just people pronouncing it differently. Shakespeare, 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 like however you're saying it, okay? So kind of amazing. So here are some of the phrases that are coined by Shakespeare that you might hear of still today. The green-eyed monster, jealousy, right? In a pickle, love is blind, salad days, wear my heart on my sleeve, there's the rub, it's cruel to be kind, sending someone on a wild goose chase, the dogs of war, or strange bedfellows. These are all things that you'll run into in the course of everyday language. So the green-eyed monster is originally from Othello, what we're about to read. It means being envious or jealous. In a pickle means you're like in a jam, in a difficult or unpleasant situation. No one had ever used this before he wrote The Tempest. So he's like inventing these, right? Love is blind. This is from The Merchant of Venice, where he talks about, how love is blind. You can't necessarily see, right? What the flaws are of the other person, right? Salad days are like one's youth or heydays. My salad days when I was green in judgment when I was younger is from Antony and Cleopatra. Wearing your heart on your sleeve is from Othello again. So like displaying your feelings openly. I can't help but wear my heart on my sleeve, right? I'm here. Here's how I feel about it. There's the rub. That's the problem. This is from Hamlet. Okay, it's cruel to be kind, meaning it's helpful but perceived as hurtful. Okay, again from Hamlet. Sending someone on a wild goose chase, like a complicated and fruitless search, like in Romeo and Juliet. The dogs of war, the horrors of war. This is sometimes used in the news, this phrase. So if you Google it, you can see it there. And strange bedfellows are an unlikely alliance. Okay, there's additional phrases here. These aren't even all of them. I just want to give you a little bit of a feeling for his tremendous influence on the English language and why English was so flexible at the time and how he was able to add to it so much. Shakespeare really was like the OG influencer, and he influenced our language tremendously. He's also referred to still in a ton of different ways in the news, in social media, in memes, in shows, in films. In our first introductions discussion board, you'll see that I asked you to take a screenshot or show where you see Shakespeare in a 21st century reference. He's still very much alive and well in our references today. Why is that? We're going to find out a little bit over the next couple of weeks together. But keep your eyes peeled for these kind of references, because in your final research paper for this class, we will be going over how we see him and his influence in the 21st century. Okay, so I hope that you take something from this today. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you online.